Welcome back, everyone. This video is going to kick off a series on Descartes' epistemology. Epistemology is just a fancy word that means about knowledge or relating to knowledge. So this video will help you understand Descartes' project by looking at it in his own words, relating it to some contemporary problems we face, and then distinguish between two stages of that project. Along the way, we'll also talk about a notion known as foundationalism and the epistemic regress. We'll look at what Descartes' conclusions that he's trying to draw from the meditations are, but then we'll say where our discussion is going to focus since we won't talk about all of those issues. So here's the project in Descartes' own words. He says, "It's now some years since I detected how many were the false beliefs that I had from my earliest youth admitted as true." So he starts with an observation that a lot of the things he used to believe turned out to be wrong. And then he draws an implication from this. He says, "And how doubtful was everything I had since constructed on this basis?" Well, he says, if a lot of the things that I learned ended up being false, how can I trust any of the other things that I learned in a similar way? He says, "And from that time, I was convinced that I must once for all seriously undertake to rid myself of all the opinions which I had formerly accepted and commence to build anew from the foundations." And he thinks he needs to do this, he says, if I wanted to establish any firm and permanent structure in the sciences. So the false beliefs that Descartes had in mind here were intimately tied to the fact that he lived at the beginning of the scientific revolution. So he lived around the same time as Galileo, a little bit after Copernicus, and a little bit before Isaac Newton. Now, for instance, during this time, Galileo famously proved that the sun does not revolve around the earth, but the earth revolves around the sun. Now, that kind of idea and many other ideas from that new science had drastic implications for the way we thought about ourselves and our place in the world. Now, Descartes himself was involved in this scientific revolution. He accepted the science that was being developed by people like Galileo. He made his own contributions to optics and mathematics. But Descartes had learned all these previous beliefs from teachers, from religious figures, from books, etc. And they turned out to be wrong. But now a lot of the other things he believes he learned in a similar way. So he wonders, how can he be certain that those other things are also true? How can he be sure that this new science that he's adopted from Galileo is also true? And that's not just going to be replaced, say, 10, 100 years from now with something supposedly better. Despite that historical context, we can also relate his observation and predicament to our own lives today. Think about the following. What are some things that you used to believe that turned out to be wrong? Where did you get those beliefs, and what made you give them up? Are you certain that in the future you're not going to just find out that many of your current beliefs are wrong? And how much you relate Descartes' concerns to questions about fake news and whether and when we can trust the things we read on the internet? This is a pretty hot topic today. Descartes attempts to get out of this situation and to gain a firm and permanent knowledge by adopting a two-stage project. First is the destruction phase. If I want to rebuild a building, the first thing I need to do is clear the ground. I need to bring in the bulldozers and destroy everything so I have a clean lay of land to build on. Descartes thinks he needs to do the same thing with his beliefs. He needs to knock down and get rid of all his beliefs so that the only things that are left are solid foundation of things that he knows for certain to be true. Once he's done that destruction, he'll take any knowledge that survived all that bulldozing, and he'll use that to help him rebuild his beliefs on what is now much stronger ground. So at the end of this project, at the end of the 6 meditations, we won't read all of them, Descartes hopes that the reader is going to reach various conclusions about people and our knowledge and our place in the world. Conclusions about the foundations of human knowledge. So where are good places to start our thinking about the world? Conclusions about the source of human knowledge. So where does our knowledge come from? He also thinks it teaches us things about God and science. So Descartes was using these meditations as a kind of hidden way of defending his commitment to Galileo's new science that was developing. It's also supposed to help us reach conclusions about the nature of human persons. So you've heard me and Descartes talk about the foundations of knowledge. Why might you talk that way? Well, we often support our beliefs by appealing to an argument from other beliefs that we hold. So if I hold a belief Z, you might ask me, well, how do I know that Z is true? And I might support my belief by trying to give an argument for it. I give you a premise Y, and I say, therefore Z. But an argument only gives knowledge of its conclusion if its logic is good, and, crucially, only if I know that its premises are true. So consider again this argument. Y, therefore Z. Whatever the premise is, whatever the conclusion is. The argument only gives me knowledge if I know that its premise Y is true. So how do I know that the premises of that argument are true? Well, I might try to support my belief that that premise is true by making a new argument. I can say, well, look, X is true, therefore Y. But then the same issue arises. How do I know that this premise is true? How do I know that X is true? If I continue to try to appeal to an argument, the process is just going to repeat over and over. How do I know that X is true? Well, because W. How do I know that W is true? Well, because V. How do I know that V is true? Well, because U. How do I know that U is true? Well, because T. You see where this is going. It doesn't stop. It's like the little kid asking, why? So this is known as what's called the epistemic regress problem. Once we start giving this sort of chain of beliefs to support other beliefs, it seems as if there's sort of three possibilities. Either our chain of beliefs just continues infinitely, or our chain of beliefs sort of circles back on itself. You say, how do you know A? And I say, well, because B. And then you say, well, how do you know B? And I say, well, because C. And then you say, how do you know C? Well, because A. When I give those beliefs to support mine, they might sort of circle back on each other in this way. Or I might be like the parent where the kid keeps asking why, and eventually you reach a stopping point and the parent just says, because. That's the way it is. You reach that belief where you just stop giving reasons. This is where someone might give a regress argument to say that there has to be a foundation for our beliefs or for knowledge. That is, if we have any knowledge about the world, then either that knowledge has to come from an infinite chain of beliefs that we have, a circular chain of beliefs, or some foundational knowledge, some knowledge that does not require support from any of our other beliefs. We can't gain knowledge from an infinite chain of beliefs because we just can't go through an infinite amount of arguments. Also, a circle is not going to help us because you can't just sort of say, I know A because A. When you go in a circle, that's what you're doing. It looks like if humans have any knowledge, there needs to be some beliefs that sort of stand on their own, so to speak. So Descartes accepts that foundational picture and explains it with an architecture analogy. Every building requires a foundation to support it, and similarly, all our knowledge requires starting beliefs. But knowledge can't be built on just any random starting beliefs. So if the foundation of a building is insecure, then everything built on top of that foundation is also insecure. Similarly, if the foundations of our beliefs are arbitrary or just random guesses, every belief built on top of that foundation is also arbitrary, random, and just a pure guess. So if we want to actually have knowledge rather than just mere guesses, it seems like we need to figure out which beliefs can actually serve the function of a secure foundation or a strong starting point. However, this raises the question, how could we have any assurance that one of these starting beliefs is true if there's no argument to support it? Now, traditionally, there's two families of views regarding the source of human knowledge that might help answer this question. One is called empiricism, the other is called rationalism. So the empiricist view is that all our knowledge must ultimately be justified by sense experience. When someone keeps asking, how do you know? How do you know? How do you know? How do you know? In order to have knowledge, eventually you have to reach a belief that is justified by your sensory experiences, by what you see, hear, touch, smell, taste, etc. The rationalist view says that at least some of our knowledge is ultimately justified by our reason rather than sense experience. So when someone keeps asking, how do you know? How do you know? How do you know? How do you know? In order to have knowledge, eventually you have to reach a belief that's justified purely by using your thought or reason. At the beginning of the Meditations, Descartes starts with this idea that sense experience is currently the foundation of our beliefs. But when he starts with that assumption, he runs into a problem where he thinks this leads to skepticism, where he says, if that's the foundation, He thinks it's not a strong foundation. And so we ought to look for a different foundation. And this, he thinks the solution is to go to rationalism and to use reason as the foundation of our beliefs rather than experience. Descartes believes that by using our reason correctly, we can then get knowledge about our own mind and even about God's existence and about the nature of God. This leads Descartes to the following ideas about how our knowledge works. We know our minds and God's existence better than anything else, according to Descartes. And he thinks these beliefs, since we know these best, need to serve as the starting point, the foundation for supporting any other knowledge we might get, including our knowledge of mathematics and science. So this is Descartes trying to reconcile, on the one hand, his scientific beliefs with his religious beliefs. How can you sort of put those beliefs together? Well, Descartes say they actually go well together when you rely on your reason to get your religious beliefs rather than relying on religious tradition or what the Catholic Church teaches. When you use your reason to arrive at those beliefs, those are the most secure, and then you can use those actually as a way to confirm that your mathematical beliefs and your scientific beliefs are going to be reliable. His trust in the science and mathematics is founded on his religious beliefs that he thinks are even more certain. Finally, Descartes also thinks that his reflections on these ideas will support the view that human beings are composed of two fundamentally different parts. He thinks people are composed of a physical body and an immaterial non-physical mind, or soul. We're not going to be looking in detail at all of these ideas in Descartes' Meditations. Our current discussion in this series of videos is going to focus on why does Descartes believe that sense experience doesn't provide a strong foundation for scientific knowledge? And why does Descartes believe that we know the mind better than the physical or material world? Later in the course, we're going to consider Descartes' reasons for believing that the mind is something immaterial or non-physical, but we're not going to do that quite yet. So that's all for this brief introduction to Descartes' project. See you in the next video.